So we're looking at Eastern Partnership, obviously. Focus today is looking through the prism or the lens of civil society, the idea of civic engagement, civic emancipation, which I think is a really crucial focal point to look at. In my view, the donors and the European Union, they came rather late into realizing how important civil society, however we define it, should actually be supported. So I feel like we're playing catch up still with regards to how we work with civil society groups and individuals in the Eastern Partnership region. I could say quite a lot myself. We've only got 1 hour, so I'm going to jump to introducing our 3 speakers. Each of them will talk for a maximum of kind of 8 or 10 minutes or so. What I suggest is that if people have some questions or thoughts throughout the 3 presentations, they can put those into the chat function and I will take kind of notes along the way. But after each speaker has had their turn in giving their presentation, we should have a good kind of 25 minutes or so for some debate and discussion as well. And I think that given the nature of the topic and recent events, especially in Georgia and Belarus and Moldova as well, it is important that we leave ourselves with a considerable amount of time to raise questions and discuss stuff. So last week I already gave our speakers a number of questions to consider, to look at. And very briefly, they were to do with, Visegrad Insight produced 4 scenarios last year, just over a year ago, I guess, in fact. One of my questions was, is it now time for a 5th scenario? Have things changed so much, not least in view of COVID, that maybe a 5th scenario is more appropriate now? I also asked them to think about, what about the inequalities within Eastern Partnership countries, inequalities to do with gender, to do with age, to do with rural and urban divides? What kind of remedy can the international donor community do to tackle those issues? And wanted them also to think about, Belarus, current civic engagement. Can this go a step further? Might it lead to something more thorough in terms of change? And what about Moldova? Should Moldova be hitched onto the EU membership cart rather than remaining an Eastern Partnership country? And ultimately, the question for me is whether we think we've been successful at supporting civil society, and whether there are perhaps different routes and better methods that we could support that dimension of reform and transition in the Eastern Partnership region. Anyway, so that's me. So our 3 speakers, very diverse with very interesting and varied backgrounds. We have Joerg Forbrig, who's Senior Fellow and Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund. And he's an expert on the region, but in particular, transition questions and democracy. Then we have Anna Westerholm, who works at the Swedish MFA, where she's the ambassador for the Eastern Partnership region. Then we have Jerzy Pomianowski, who is the executive director of the European Endowment for Democracy. Now, each of these people have a wealth of other backgrounds and previous titles, but I just kind of focused on their current work to give us time to hear and to discuss their views. So let's begin with Joerg, and feel free to have kind of 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Kerry, and thanks to Visegrad Insight for putting this together, as well as everything that has gone into this project before that, the scenario exercise itself, the many discussions that have been held with partners across the region. So many thanks for this. It's a pleasure to be here. What I thought, Kerry, and all, was that I sort of zoom in to the first question. The question sort of whether over the 2 years since these scenarios were elaborated, whether there are significant developments that sort of make one or another scenario perhaps more likely, require adjustments, COVID in particular, but not only. So I wanted to sort of very quickly go through the 4 scenarios at this stage, perhaps also as a reminder of what they were for those who may not be as familiar with them. So the first of these scenarios, which we titled Pragmatic Integration, basically posited that more or less the status quo between the EU and the Eastern Partnership countries would remain as is for the foreseeable future. There may be a deepening of some of the economic and technical cooperation. There may even be some approximation also with some of the countries that have remained behind so far. But there's no ambition towards any political integration, any real association, and more of the region with the European Union. What that also means over time is that perhaps the enthusiasm for the entire European project in the region would weaken. Now, if we look at COVID, it fits quite well into this scenario, because in principle, the pandemic basically provides the sort of EU Eastern Partnership nexus with an additional layer of cooperation. In many ways, very technical in kind, something that fits well into the tone of basically the relationship between the EU and the Eastern Partnership. There's been a solidarity program that was put out by the European Union with some immediate support, also a larger, about €1 billion in longer term funding to soften some of the economic fallout and impact of the pandemic. There's also some support program in the direction of assistance with vaccination over the last 3 years. So there are elements basically that the EU has put out very much in the spirit of this technical more than political cooperation. Now, I think the jury is still out what this will do also to the scenario as we outlined it. Probably depends on two things in particular. I mean, the one is obviously how effectively this EU support will actually be placed and help to remedy some of the impact of the pandemic in the Eastern Partnership countries. The other one is certainly and always how well the EU is able to address the pandemic at home in the EU itself, because that shapes a lot of its credibility, obviously also vis-a-vis a neighboring region like the one with the Eastern Partnership. The second of the scenarios was titled Russian Hegemony Revisited. This is basically a scenario where we posit that that Russia manages to strengthen again its sway in the Eastern Partnership region as such overall in Eastern Europe. Part of it is certainly a result of an EU weakness in the region. Some of it is a result of political divisions in individual countries, of economic troubles in Eastern Partnership countries. All of this opens basically gates for Russia to engage more strongly again and more strongly than it already has so far. I think there are two key developments over the last year or two that are not really COVID related here. That sort of make me reconsider some of these scenarios. The first is the political crisis in Belarus. I mean, it's a conflict that is unresolved, but I think everybody acknowledges how much of the solution to this crisis will depend on Moscow. It is the Kremlin that keeps up the Lukashenko regime. The second is the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. I think it's a clear assertion of Russia's role in the region. The EU, the US have been completely absent from the entire development. It is Russia primarily, to some extent Turkey. So I think, again, a development that basically speaks in favor of this scenario, Russian hegemony revisited. Now, COVID can be an additional opportunity here for Russia. I mean, first, there is the weakening of countries politically and economically from within under the impact of the pandemic. The other one is vaccines, vaccine diplomacy, the Russian vaccine as a lever. So far, there's only one country in the region, that is Belarus, that has received Sputnik 5. Will also produce it, but I could well imagine that if the sort of vaccine disaster continues as we've seen it evolving so far, that some of the countries in the region will be reaching out here for that Russian vaccine, which in turn may welcome and will most likely come with a political price attached. So there is still something that is out there as a potential additional tool for Russia to influence developments in the region. The third scenario we called EU pivot to Moscow. For me personally, one that sort of was most debatable already at the time. It basically posits that the EU would somehow strive to cultivate a new relationship with Russia, a sort of makeover of the strained relations of the last years. Basically based on a geopolitical calculus with the idea in mind that both countries were challenged by China, or both the EU and Russia were challenged by China and its rise. And in this sort of pivot by the EU to Russia, the countries in between, the Eastern Partnership countries in particular, would by and large be neglected. The Eastern Partnership would continue to exist as a shell, as it were, perhaps also with the achievements that have been made so far, but no further progress. And over time, individual countries of the region would also slide back into a much stronger dependency on Russia than many of them have so far already. There are several aspects here again that relate especially to the COVID pandemic. The first is again a political and economic weakening of both of the countries of the region, which would take place. It remains an unknown to which extent the EU support and solidarity on COVID to the Eastern Partnership region will really have an effect, both materially as well as in societies. It is open today to which extent Russia's vaccine diplomacy will bear fruit in the region, but we already see it bearing fruit in some EU countries. Hungary, Slovakia have already received doses. Others may consider that vaccine, which then also builds a different momentum inside of the EU towards perhaps a normalization of relationships with Russia. I would say, sort of speaking against that scenario of an EU-Russia nexus again, is obviously a transatlantic aspect. That is a new administration in the US, which seems to have a very strong focus on issues like democracy. With it, also Central and Eastern Europe, in my opinion, and observably already a harder line on Russia. These are factors that from the other side of the Atlantic may well mitigate against any temptations that the EU may have to normalize its relationship with Russia. The last of the scenarios, we called it civic emancipation, is basically sort of based on a groundswell of citizen engagement, of civil society activity in individual Eastern Partnership countries, driven not so much by necessarily a strive for greater democracy and human rights, free elections, and so forth, but by a longer-term frustration with local elites, frustration with leaderships that have come and gone and basically not improved the lot of individual countries. Also a disappointment over time with international partners, whether it's the EU or whether it's also neighboring Russia. So basically a feeling in many of these societies that they really need to take their fate into their own hands, and they can't count on anybody, whether their own elites or international partners. And at the time, 2 years ago, when we worked on these scenarios, that seemed like the most idealistic of all scenarios. Now, after the last year in particular, I have the impression that this may be the scenario that has most semblance with reality, with some of the things that have happened. If we look at Belarus, we've seen a massive groundswell in civic activity, first in response to the pandemic, and then translated very quickly into a political movement in the context of the presidential elections. I think we've seen a very strong engagement of civil society in response to the pandemic elsewhere, typically in form of, in the information field, simply providing information on COVID as a watchdog over what governments do, whether it's spending or restrictions on civil liberties, whether it's support to the healthcare system at large, to vulnerable groups. So there's been a sort of very strong engagement here. And what all of this basically does is it's a response by societies to degrees of state failure. To an inability of individual governments to really handle this crisis, or to an outright negation of the crisis, as we've seen it in Belarus. I think what galled Belarusians particularly was that the government under Lukashenko at the time was basically rejecting that there is such a threat. They were basically left alone by their government, and this has been a very strong trigger, I think, in the direction of this civic engagement. I don't think that we need to necessarily sort of project a further growth of this mobilization that we've seen, whether in Belarus or elsewhere in the Eastern Partnership, in a linear way into the future. But what's clearly indicated by all of this is that somehow the relationship between state and society in individual Eastern Partnership countries is changing. COVID has been a very good illustration for that, and I think this is something that should make all of us very hopeful. So what I meant to do with my sort of brief tour de force here is to indicate some of the hooks where I see we can sort of compare scenarios as we devised them 2 years ago with developments that have taken place in the meantime. I'm looking forward to discussing all of this and Kerry's remaining questions with you later. But for the moment, I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good start. So yeah, 2 years ago since we did the scenarios, I thought I kind of missed 2020 somehow. But thank you. That was a really good start, and to do that kind of rerun of the scenarios and what recent events have kind of reshaped or impacted upon them. Okay, let's turn to Anna, and you also have kind of 8 or 10 minutes to tell us, give us your views.
Thank you. And thank you for the recap of the scenarios. When I went back in preparations of today's discussion and read the scenarios, and I found my old notes, I realized that I don't agree with myself 2 years ago, and that the events the past year has made me reconsider many of the assumptions that were self-evident 2 years ago. So thank you for the recap. What I would like to do is just to touch a little bit on the scenarios, and then perhaps a few words on civic engagement and what the EU member states can do. And let's see how far we can come, and then otherwise we'll come back to that in the Q&A session. I would say that my new reading of these 4 scenarios leads me to the conclusion that today we will see a little bit of all 4. So in a 5th scenario, if you want to write that, I would ask you to actually pick bits and pieces of all the 4. None of them are clear cut, but there are elements of truth in all of them. And just you gave us a good overview of the changing situation in the region, but just to touch then, of course, when we now see the changes and the turmoil in Belarus, we have the difficulties, the political internal difficulties in Georgia right now, the previous front runner. We don't know where this is going to end. We have some positive hopes that we see for Moldova. We have the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, and we have in all this further dynamics playing out in the region with Russia, Turkey, Iran, as well as we have internal pressures and internal political pressure and movement in Russia itself. I think that for the future, broadly, we would have to expect quite drastic changing regional realities that we would have to take into consideration when we try to design a new 5th scenario. And on top of this, of course, the pandemic. So on the pandemic, just one of the more striking, I would say, striking conclusions or revelations here that it really brought to force the persistence of the inequalities in the region that you were also touching upon. And I could say within brackets here that it's not just for the region, it's also for ourselves. And it has increased and it has exacerbated really the existing inequalities, and it has also created some new ones. And when I talk about inequalities here, I would say it's of course the gender-based inequalities, but it's also urban-rural divides. It's the young and old. It is access to public health. It is the digital divide, and so on and so on. So there are lots of inequalities that we need now to be very mindful of as we design, scenarios or programs going forward. On this, just allow me a few seconds on gender equality here, because when in the times of crisis, whether that's pandemic or others, women are always the hardest hit. And this is not just a matter of gender-based violence, as you point out also in your scenarios, but it's also economically. Women are the first ones to lose their jobs quite often. And we see a variety of gender gaps now exposed. We have on pay and poverty, on access to finance, and also in digitalization. And this actually appears to be growing. And this is something I think we need to be very mindful of. And the OECD recently said that the pandemic, and I quote, could set progress towards gender equality back in the region 15 years. That's quite astonishing. So taking all these inequalities together, we know that inequalities also equals vulnerabilities in a society. And with what COVID showed is also on top of that, the vulnerable nation, the vulnerable nature of the institution, the public institutions, and of the economies in the region. So their inability or their already pre-existing vulnerability has exacerbated in the times of COVID. So with this said, we all can agree that the way forward when you build your next scenario would have to be strengthening resilience even more in the broadest sense of the word. Now, coming to the fifth scenario that you asked us to think about, I would say that there are two paths here that we can go, and I would speak very broadly. And the one scenario is what I would call the risk scenario. And here you will see increased nationalism. You will see protectionism. You will see more authoritarianism, or countries moving in an authoritarian direction, or the so-called illiberal democracy, for lack of better words. And I would see the appeal as a short-term quick fix to fix a really complex problem or complex challenges. However, obviously, I don't believe that would be the right road to take. But I could see that there is a clear risk that we will see an increased tendency towards this. When we embark now on the post-COVID socio-economic recovery, which we all need to do, we really need to take on these buzzwords of building back better and leaving no one behind, and really to make that come true. So what we would need to do in the fifth scenario, rather, which I hope for, is that we'll see a stronger emphasis on equality. And I mean, in the really broadest sense of the word, we would need more cooperation and more partnership, because we are so interlinked. We are interdependent, and we would need more solidarity. So when it comes to what we would need to focus on, I believe that the priorities that we from the European Union side within the partnership are put forward would remain the same as before, but just more emphasis on democracy, on human rights, on rule of law, on anti-corruption and gender equality, and so on. We would need much more push on this, because we are actually now taking steps back on these particular issues. And if we want to move forward with a functioning socio-economic recovery, this is where we need to start. We can't do that and have it sustainable and long-term unless we actually base it on the fundamental values that is also the basis for the European Union. So this, what I would say, would be fifth scenario that I would hope for, that would reduce the vulnerabilities of the region and it will increase the resilience. In here, of course, we would have to have an enhanced digital agenda, and we would need really to build in the green transition here. That would be fundamental. On top of that, of course, and this goes without saying, we need to work much more on tackling disinformation. And that is a chapter in itself that we can come back to. I don't think I need in this group that I need to even point out why. So this would be also the thing that I hope and trust that the next phase of the Eastern Partnership will provide for or contribute to. Then let me also stress the importance here that the partner countries themselves, of course, take responsibility for their own reform agendas and really, really invest financially and politically in this now. So it's not just a matter of what the European Union can offer or contribute with, but actually what the partner countries themselves take on board and make of it. And here again, I'll come back to, but it's really important. Evidence from past crises really shows that if you exclude women in this part of the reconstruction or the rebuilding phase and from decision making, you can really warp the recovery policies. So here again, putting that on as part of the fundamental building blocks. So that is that about the scenarios. I don't know how much time I have. I would like to say a few things on civil society and what the European Union can do there, but maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A session.
It's okay for like 2 more minutes. Good.
All right. Thank you. Because the question was, with the support for the civil society and the emphasis on civic emancipation, how far has this strategy succeeded? And what could be the role of the EU and member states here to continue the support? And just a few points here. I think that one of the more important things that we can do as European member states is to continue to engage visibly with the civil society and to validate the efforts of civil society and to be really responsive. And by this, I mean that we need to actually be flexible and to hear the new voices also that arise from civil society on the ground and new groups that emerge. And that we can somehow, I mean, some of you will smile now, of course, because I represent the bureaucracy, but that we will try to be more quick and flexible in the support that we provide also when the pandemic is over. Also, of course, it's fundamental that we continue to provide political support for civil society. Again, I come back to this information. We can talk about that again, but to put more emphasis on media literacy among all groups and all ages in society, I think is something that we can do from the member states. And to also perhaps be better at providing opportunities and platform for civil society organizations to engage and to take part in international advocacy. Then one thing that is not talked about too much, and I'm not going to use complex academic terminology here, but when you talk about anti-discrimination and mainstreaming, I would like to say that we need to be looking also at the complexities of all the groups and individuals and actors taking part here. I know I've learned recently, I'm late to the party, but I learned recently about this intersectional perspective on things, and I'm embarrassed I didn't use the term before, but basically what it means is that not one group does not just represent one thing. That you can have a disadvantaged group, but they are disadvantaged in different ways. And you can have women in the city and women in rural areas, and they don't necessarily have the same needs just because they're women. Point taken. So I think that when you look at the marginalized group and you want to reduce discrimination, you need to bring in all these different groups early in the analysis of what needs to be done after the crisis and the decision making, because they are hardest hit, and then they are quite often left behind when the guys gather around the table to make decisions on the way forward. So in order to truly not leave anyone behind, I think we need to have a better inclusion of marginalized group and a more emphasis on anti-discrimination. I will stop here. I can come back to that. And if you want to ask me a question about my more in-depth views here on gender equality in terms of in civil society, I'll be happy to do that as well. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. That was really complementary to the first presentation. And again, lots of important issues for us to think about, definitely. So let's turn to Jerzy, the final speaker. And again, kind of 8-10 minutes or so will be great.
That's very generous, Kerry. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting. That's great to have all here, many friends. I see. I will be rather brief. I want to touch a few elements as those who knows what EED does. We do support people on the ground. We do provide grants. We listen to them. So we sometimes benefit from this early warning, early analysis of the situations and trends. But at the same time, we do not pretend to being a think tank. So we do not publish an extensive analysis. That is not our role. That's why it's always great pleasure to be part of exercise and discussion like today, where we have many big minds and a lot of interesting analysis that also can inspire our work in a way how we do support our partners on the ground. Speaking about what's going on the ground, we definitely can confirm that the COVID-19 has many effects, but one that I would like to underline is definitely a positive one that has brought to our attention a new energy, a new face of the civil society in the region. In every country, we see different ways of mobilization, different ways of adapting quickly of civil society to COVID situation, demanding something, explaining something, helping people, reaching out to constituency that normally they were not reaching out so easily. At the same time, independent media observed a rise in audiences. People were moving toward independent information sources to get confirmation of some of information that they were believing are not probably right one as presented by different governments in the region. And that always was not so-called usual suspect, young, educated, open-minded people, but the more general public that normally do not use or do not intend to read independent media outlets or platforms or even integrators. The Belarus protests again shown us a new type of online coordination and activism, the role of Telegram channels. This is something that if I would ask some of you 2 years ago what it is a Telegram channel, many of analysts who knows the region wouldn't even mention them and how crucial they were in managing and still are in managing the political movement, the civic movement. These are no phenomena. Of course, they are not related only to COVID. I'm already jumping to additional elements of the picture, but just wanted to say that the different type of crises brings a different type of opportunities. And this is well known for the last 3,000 years since Chinese developed this famous saying that every crisis is an opportunity. But what I want to say is also that there are challenges that remain the same. So we have new opportunities, but they are the same challenges. Joerg was already saying about Russia factor. It's there and it will not disappear. Although, if we talk about scenarios, I fully agree with Anna about fifth scenario with a certain inward-looking kind of nationalism or national feeling based I would say dynamics within Eastern Partnership countries that could be a factor. And I think this factor could be in a both negative and positive way seen as a fifth scenario. It also, in my view, potentially is correlated with the weakening influence of Russia in the region, because Russia will face for sure bigger tensions inside the country. And that is already also visible if we look carefully what's going on in Russia. Of course, it's much more difficult to see those trends, but they do exist, and they will create a context in which ability of Russia to be in control of the whole region as they try to exercise using their traditional means, corrupt money, military, of course, blackmail, like in case of Armenia, or frozen conflicts that can be unfrozen anytime. Any of this toolbox that we know very well, that is probably a potential of a scenario where this ability of use all those tools will not be that effective as it is, and it was now during the peak of Putin regime, I would say, consolidation. So in that sense, we should definitely see this as an important factor and observe not just Eastern Partnership, but the whole region, of course, including Russia, what is happening. If we talk about specific countries, we were discussing Moldova, Georgia, Belarus. I already touched a little bit about Belarus. With regard to our side, EU side, I'm always asking ourselves and my colleagues here in Brussels, do we do enough to provide an ownership for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Pavel Latushka, and others from Coordination Council to really be part of our effort and our policy design as we think what we should do for Belarus and Belarus society? Or we still consider like watching what they do, and then we are thinking what we should do? That is something that bothers me, and I think we can improve this partnership or move this partnership to the higher level, where we can potentially see a recognition and a bigger ownership of all those processes, including, in a sense, designing support programs to Belarus by those political leaderships that are already clearly visible. They have structure. They struggle, obviously, because they are young. They are still organizing themselves. They face differences. There are also egos among them. That is normal. That exists in every political and social movement. But still, they make a big effort also to build joint coordination platforms. And we should respect this, and we should admit this, and we should give them more ownership. That, what I believe, would be right direction. With regard to Moldova, obviously, as much as we can be happy with an election of Maia Sandu, we have to see the reality on the ground. The situation is extremely difficult. The people who are on the payroll of Plahotniuc did not disappear. They are still sitting in the parliament. The pro-Russian party led by Dodon is still there. And they are having majority. They are running government. They are running key institutions. And prerogatives of the presidents are not very strong. So it's really symbolic. It's important. Coming election may bring a change, but may be also extremely challenging. That's why, especially supporting independent media, supporting still civil and political society within Moldova should be an important priority, because situation is far from so-called done deal, and now everyone will live ever long, happy, and together. That is not the case, but the chance is there. Similarly with Georgia, definitely the situation with regard to civil society is positive from the point of view that we see a lot of new energy, and also difficult because we see also the level of inertia in a society, how difficult is to bring people to the real debate, to escape from the traditional division, Ivanishvili, Saakashvili. That is something that is still a challenging part of the Georgia landscape, and the political and civic movements. They are struggling with this to find a proper language, proper even debate, to say that these are not only choices we have. There is something else within the society, especially with the youth, that people can rely on and potentially trust. And that is definitely most interesting part, but very challenging. In Armenia, I mean, Azerbaijan, we don't need to discussion, the same regime strengthened now with the, victorious military operation. So even the independent dissidents, they are now calming down their voices because the society is so overwhelmed with this feeling of national pride and victory that always kills any discussion about civil society rights and the freedoms in the country. And Armenia, where the generals are, accusing government of being defeated, and again, people who are trying to find a moderate approach to the war and the whole situation they were into, they have no voice. They are called traitors. They are smear campaigns over different online platforms towards just the people who say, let's talk normally about this. Let's reduce emotions. Let's see things how they are. And that is war is always most damaging to democracy and to civil society as it can be. So this is an extremely unhappy context that will require not months but years to get rid of and to go back to some kind of more, I would say, normal processes inside the country to free country from this war or lost war rhetoric. And finally, if we look into Ukraine, that's such a big subject that maybe I will not talk now because it's too much. But I would say one more thing about EU kind of suggestions or what we can do within EU better than we do now. I think still we have within EU this very kind of intergovernmental organization logic, which is obvious because EU is intergovernmental organization. But I think we are still not doing enough to engage the whole of the society, I mean democratic societies within EU. There's a huge potential of different charity organizations, of different faith-based organizations, of different kind of organizations that are operating within EU that still do not have enough role, but also design programs for them to extend their reach outside of EU and to reach out to the Eastern Partnership countries and societies. I'm not saying it is not happening. There are some, but I think we can still do more. So if we look, for example, at support to civil society within the Eastern Partnership, this support is usually done through the government support via tenders to either local civil society or European civil society that is specialized in supporting Eastern Partnership countries. And I am talking here about that part of civil society of EU that is not specialized in Eastern Partnership countries, but that has extremely big organization and interaction potential because simply these are big partners, big organizations. And I think we can use them more in a situation like Belarus today. If we imagine providing a kind of social aid type and avoiding government structures, because that struggle today EU has, that if we now try to launch small and medium-sized business programs, we unavoidably need to go through the government structures within Belarus itself. And that there are ways to go around. There are ways to find more innovative approaches. But for this, we would need to engage people within EU that normally are not engaged with the Eastern Partnership countries. And that's what I would call the whole of society approach.